Let me tell you something about organized crime that the films and the television series almost always get wrong. They make it look glamorous. They make it look like a meritocracy, like a world where the smartest, the hardest, the most capable rise to the top through a kind of brutal competence that the legitimate world does not reward but that the criminal world recognizes and elevates. The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, The Wire, brilliant pieces of storytelling. And all of them, to varying degrees, romanticize the specific psychological mechanisms through which organized crime actually operates. Because here is what the forensic sociology and social psychology research finds when you examine how criminal hierarchies actually maintain themselves. They are not primarily maintained by violence. Violence is expensive, attention-attracting, and unpredictable. You cannot run a billion-dollar bearsfoot criminal enterprise on violence alone. They are maintained by psychology, by the specific, sophisticated, often extraordinarily effective application of the same psychological mechanisms that the research on cults, on coercive control, on authoritarian institutions, and on the social psychology of loyalty and compliance has been documenting for decades, and understanding those mechanisms, honestly, forensically, without the romanticization, is one of the most important things the social psychology research can give us for understanding not just organized crime, but the broader question of how human beings get captured by systems that destroy them. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the entry point, because understanding how people get into organized crime is the foundation for understanding everything that keeps them there. The popular narrative treats entry into organized crime as primarily a rational choice. The person weighs the risks and rewards, decides the criminal world offers better returns than the legitimate world, and makes the decision. The research on criminal recruitment and the developmental literature on how criminal organizations identify and cultivate members find something considerably more complicated and considerably more psychologically specific. Organized criminal groups recruit at the margins of legitimate opportunity, not because the criminal world is the only option available to the people it recruits, because it understands how to present itself as the most attractive option to people who have specific psychological vulnerabilities that the legitimate world has, either ignored or actively produced. Sudhir Venkatesh's ethnographic research on gang dynamics, conducted through years of embedded observation with Chicago gang structures, found that the specific attraction of the criminal hierarchy was not primarily financial. It was social. The gang provided identity, belonging, status, and the specific experience of being part of something that valued and protected you. In communities where the legitimate social structures had failed to provide any of those things, this is the entry mechanism the research consistently finds, not the rational economic calculation. The meeting of genuine and unmet psychological needs, the belonging that the isolated person had not found elsewhere, the identity that the person without legitimate status pathways had not been able to construct through conventional means, the protection that the person in a dangerous environment had not been able to access through legitimate channels. The criminal organization does not recruit by explaining the risks and the rewards. It recruits by providing the specific experience of being wanted, valued, and included in something that has coherence, hierarchy, and purpose. Here is the piece that the social psychology research on loyalty makes most important for understanding how criminal hierarchies maintain themselves. Loyalty in organized crime is not simply an expectation. It is a manufactured psychological state, produced through specific and deliberate mechanisms that the research on social bonding, identity fusion, and commitment escalation documents with considerable precision. The first mechanism is what researchers call sunk cost commitment. Every action the recruit takes that carries criminal liability is simultaneously an action and that deepens their commitment to the organization, because leaving becomes progressively more costly as involvement deepens. The person who has witnessed crimes, participated in crimes, built a life, and an identity inside the criminal structure faces a leaving calculation that is not simply about desire, but about survival. This is not accidental. The research on organized crime initiation rituals and the specific ways that criminal organizations structure early involvement finds that the escalation of commitment is often deliberately managed. The small asks that become larger asks, the witness position that becomes the participant position, the gradual deepening of criminal involvement that makes each subsequent step feel like a small increment from the last and makes the cumulative departure from the world outside feel irreversible. The psychology of commitment escalation. Robert Cialdini's foundational research on consistency and commitment is directly relevant. Once a person has committed to a position through action, the psychological drive toward consistency with that commitment is one of the most powerful motivational forces available. The criminal organization understands this intuitively even when its leadership has never heard of Cialdini. The second mechanism is identity fusion. William Swan's research on the phenomenon through which individual identity becomes merged with group identity to the point where an attack on the group is experienced as an attack on the self is directly applicable to the psychology of criminal group membership. The criminal organization provides an identity that is not just external affiliation, it becomes internal definition. The person stops being a person who is a member of the organization and becomes a person for whom membership is constitutive of who they are. And that identity fusion is maintained through the specific rituals, the specific language, the specific symbolic markers of membership that the research on group identity consistently identifies as the tools of its construction. Now let me talk about fear, because fear is the other half of the loyalty equation and the half that the research documents with the most forensic precision. The violence that organized criminal hierarchies deploy is not primarily punitive, it is communicative. This is the finding that the research on criminal violence and the sociological literature on the function of violence in illegal markets most consistently produces. Diego Gambetta's foundational work on the Sicilian Mafia, one of the most rigorous sociological examinations of organized crime ever conducted, identified violence in criminal hierarchies as primarily a signal, a costly, credible, unmistakable signal about what the consequences of disloyalty are. The violence that is visible, that is witnessed by members of the organization and by the communities around it, does not primarily affect the people it directly injures. It affects the people who see it, who encode the signal, who update their own behavioral calculus. Accordingly, this is the mechanism through which organized crime maintains compliance, not through the constant application of violence, but through the credible threat of it. The organization does not need to punish every deviation. It needs to punish enough deviations, visibly enough that the probability of punishment for any deviation feels sufficiently high to maintain compliance. The research on deterrence theory in criminal contexts and the specific psychological mechanisms through which threat credibility produces compliance is directly relevant here. The most effective deterrent is not the most severe punishment. It is the most credible punishment. The punishment that everyone who needs to believe it actually believes will occur. The criminal hierarchy that has established its credibility, that has demonstrated through specific, visible, memorable acts of violence that the threat is real, can maintain compliance with a frequency of actual violence that is much lower than the threat environment would suggest, because the threat has been made credible by the demonstration, and the demonstration does not need to be repeated as long as the credibility holds. Here is the research on why people stay. Because this is the question that most people outside criminal hierarchies find most difficult to understand, and the one that the psychology of coercive control most directly answers. The person inside an organized criminal hierarchy who wants to leave faces a specific and well-documented set of barriers that the research on coercive control, developed primarily in the context of intimate partner violence, but applying with equal precision to the criminal organization context, identifies as the primary mechanisms of entrapment. The first is isolation. The criminal organization systematically manages the social world of its members in ways that reduce their connection to the legitimate social networks that would provide alternative support, alternative identity, and alternative possibility. The social world of the member contracts progressively around the organization. Family relationships are strained or severed. Legitimate friendships become difficult to maintain. The person's entire social infrastructure becomes internal to the criminal structure. This isolation is not always deliberately engineered. Sometimes it is the natural consequence of the lifestyle. But the research on how criminal organizations respond to members who attempt to maintain strong, legitimate social connections finds that those connections are frequently perceived as threats, as potential sources of information, as alternative loyalty structures, and managed accordingly. The second barrier is the information control that the criminal organization exercises over how the member understands their own situation. The research on thought reform, Robert Lifton's foundational work on the specific mechanisms through which closed systems manage the information available to their members, finds that organized criminal hierarchies, like cults and like other coercive institutions, manage information in ways that sustain the members' commitment by limiting their access to the frameworks that would allow them to think their way out. The narrative the organization provides about loyalty, about the outside world, about the consequences of departure, about what membership means and requires, is not simply accepted passively. It is actively reinforced through the specific social environment of the organization, through the conversations, the relationships, the constant immersion in a social world that validates the organizational narrative and provides no meaningful exposure to alternatives. Let me talk about the leadership psychology, because the people at the top of organized criminal hierarchies are not simply the most violent. The research finds something more psychologically interesting. Diego Gambetta's research and the subsequent forensic literature on criminal leadership consistently finds a specific psychological profile at the apex of successful criminal organizations, not the impulsive, hot-tempered enforcer of popular imagination, the calculated, psychologically sophisticated manager of relationships, of information, and of the specific trust mechanisms through which the criminal hierarchy operates. The most successful criminal leaders, the ones whose organizations persist across decades and across the challenges of law enforcement pressure, internal betrayal, and external competition, are characterized by a specific combination that the clinical research on dark triad personalities recognizes immediately: the strategic intelligence to model complex social environments accurately, the psychopathic capacity to make decisions without the emotional cost that most people's affective empathy imposes, the narcissistic grandiosity that sustains the conviction of exceptional capability, and the Machiavellian social manipulation that maintains the loyalty of a hierarchy through the precise calibration of reward and threat. This combination does not produce the most dramatic criminal figures. It produces the most durable ones, the ones who understand that the criminal organization is primarily a social system and that managing it requires the same sophisticated understanding of human psychology that managing any complex social system requires. James Fallon's research on the neuroscience of psychopathy and the specific ways that reduced effective empathy combined with intact cognitive social intelligence produces a specific capacity for instrumental relationship management is directly relevant to understanding why this specific profile is so consistently found at the apex of criminal hierarchies. The criminal leader is not simply the most dangerous person in the organization. They are the most psychologically sophisticated manager of the specific mechanisms, fear, loyalty, identity, information, through which the organization maintains itself. Here is something the research identifies that almost never makes it into the conversation about organized crime: the specific psychological experience of leaving. Because the research on criminal desistance, the process through which individuals exit criminal careers, is one of the most important and least publicly discussed bodies of work in the criminology literature. Shad Marina's foundational research on criminal desistance identified something that directly challenges the rational choice model of criminal exit. People do not primarily leave criminal careers because the risk-reward calculation shifts. They leave because their identity shifts, because something, a relationship, a crisis, a developmental moment, provides the specific conditions under which a different self-concept becomes possible, a self-concept that does not require the criminal identity for its coherence. This is the research finding that matters most for intervention, because if criminal career persistence is primarily an identity phenomenon rather than rational economic phenomenon, then the interventions most likely to produce genuine desistance are not the ones that change the risk-reward calculation. They are the ones that provide the specific conditions under which identity reconstruction is possible, the legitimate identity, the genuine relationship, the community connection that provides the belonging that the criminal organization provided without the coercion that the criminal organization attached to it. Maruna calls this the redemption script, the specific narrative that allows the person leaving a criminal career to construct a coherent self-concept out of the material of their history. Not by denying the criminal past, by integrating it into a story that the person can live forward from. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of organized crime is not the psychology of monsters. It is not the psychology of people who are fundamentally different from the rest of us in ways that make their choices incomprehensible. It is the psychology of specific social mechanisms, of manufactured loyalty, of credible threat, of identity fusion, of isolation and information control, applied systematically to produce compliance in people whose genuine needs were met in no other way available to them. The research is clear on something that the romantic and the moralistic narratives both miss. Organized criminal hierarchies do not primarily recruit the worst people. They recruit people in specific circumstances, with specific unmet needs, with specific limited alternatives. And they meet those needs in ways that the legitimate world either could not or chose not to provide. Understanding that is not the same as excusing the violence, the exploitation, and the genuine harm that organized crime produces. Those harms are real, and their moral weight is not reduced by psychological explanation. But it is the beginning of understanding why the systems persist, why the people inside them stay, why the rational exit that looks obvious from outside is experienced as impossible from inside, and why the interventions that work are not the ones that simply increase the punishment, but the ones that provide what the criminal hierarchy was providing, without everything the criminal hierarchy attached to it. If this video gave you a framework for understanding something that has always seemed incomprehensible, please like it and subscribe to the channel. These forensic psychology deep dives are what this channel is built for, and every like and every subscription helps this research reach the people who need it most.